Can nobody not hear me in the back? Okay, hello, my name is Evan Sharp. This is from Comp to Code, a design communion. Thanks everyone for sticking around for the last talk on the last day of MIX. Try and keep this relatively succinct and interesting. So just to give you a little bit of context about myself, as I said, my name is Evan Sharp. Right now, I am a product designer at Facebook. Product designers are the people at Facebook who kind of develop and refine the interfaces for the core Facebook products, which are things like, chat, newsfeed, not third-party applications, but everything else. And just a note about being a product designer at Facebook. All product designers are required to know CSS, HTML. Most of them know PHP, or at least are able to work within PHP. Some of them even dive into the data layers and things. And so that'll come back into play, I think, later on as we talk about using CSS more as a design medium. I'm also the founder of a small web design firm called Header Footer. And actually, I shouldn't say a web design firm. We try and do a lot of things, information design, a little bit of dabbling in prototypes for architecture, things like that. And I'm currently on leave right now from the architecture program at Columbia University. So enough about me. Let's get into the code. So what is this talk about? Is it about how to code CSS? That sounds pretty boring to me, especially for the last talk. Is it about how to take image mockups, comps as we call them, and translate them into front-end code? I mean, yes, it's about that, but it's actually more, I think, about the idea of code as what makes web designers so powerful within the design profession. So to talk about code is to talk about not just turning a static comp into something that people can interact with. It's actually about building the experience on the web. It seems obvious, but I just think it's worth saying. Talking about writing code is talking about all of the little details of the experience. And so in a way, I think CSS and HTML and front-end code are really what differentiates the whole sphere of a web design from their peers. That said, there's also a danger. And the danger with code is that we tend to see code as separate from design and web design, or many people see it as separate. So I think even the title of this talk, From Comp to Code, has that kind of built in the idea, the assumption that design comps are separate somehow from the final product. And so again, later on in the talk, we'll talk more about integrating CSS into design, and I think that's very important for taking advantage of these powers. So to keep going in this vein, what is so special about web design? Why is web the zeitgeist? Why are we all so excited about it? And personally, I think of myself as more of a communication designer, whatever that means, than a web designer. I see myself as kind of taking all of the crazy information that the web has and communicating that through design to the public or to the users. So code, front end and back end, that's what gives us this unbelievable scale of information. And so controlling code is what allows us to be effective on the web, like I said. So just humor me for a couple more minutes. We're going to talk about, very basically, you guys are going to know this already, but what separates communication on the web from other mediums, and why is that important to front-end coding? So obviously, the first thing is that web is an interactive medium. All content on the web is affected by the context of the web, so where it is. All the links, the very basic beginnings of the internet, which are all text-based, is kind of a good way to think about what's different about content on the web and how it coexists outside of its site. How content on like a website coexists with content from other websites at the same time. Another difference is that web content has users, right? The word user. The word user implies somebody operating something. So web content has users. They're customers, of course. There's this push to use the word customers, but they're still using something. Even the most minimal interface, even the most static website, is still an interface. And it's still a decision to go with that static site. And so in a way, we've taken the idea of communication design up to a higher level. I think the web has really taught designers that there are no givens, that even if you're communicating through the most basic blog page, it still requires picking that blog as a medium as opposed to all the other possible ones like print design or more detailed interfaces. So maybe the second point to this is that the web is accessible. And by accessible, I mean is capable of being accessed by an unknown number of devices. And so web design and web designers have little control over the device their site is accessed by. And more than that, they have absolutely no control over the environment in which their design is seen. So print designers, for example, can pick a paper type. They can get proofs for their design printed out, and they can look at the proof and change it. Architects, for example, are given a location and a building, and that location tells them what the climate will be. It tells them what the light will be like coming in. It tells them what kind of infrastructure exists around the building. And so on the web, where my website may be accessed on a phone, on some sort of PDA, on a computer, and on this whole new realm of devices that's kind of coming down the pipe, we're giving up even more control. And so in a way, I think web design is defined by our lack of control over the physical experience, even though there are exceptions to this rule. And the most obvious example of this is that I don't know what people are going to interact with my content with. Are they going to use their finger? Are they going to use a mouse? Are they going to use a stylus? I don't know, and it shouldn't necessarily matter in some ways. And so the third point, and the point that we're going to focus on for the rest of the talk, is the fact and the idea that web content is coded in some way. And what this means to designers is that web content is flourishing in this rich field of metadata that we can then use to build more powerful interfaces. It also means that all web content is implicitly hierarchical. And this is huge, right? This is what powers the web, is the hierarchy, the directory level structure of a web page. But I think this hierarchical, this obstinate hierarchy actually distracts designers from visualizing the designed hierarchy on the page. So laying out something in Photoshop, of course there's still a hierarchy, but the hierarchy is different from the HTML hierarchy, and that's a key point. So again, websites are decorated directories. They're hierarchical. And as web designers, we are manipulating that hierarchy. And what's interesting to me is that this is not, if you think back to the beginning of the internet, this is not necessarily how web design had to end up. Who says that web designers have to take these directories of information that's in an HTML file and kind of lay them out? There could easily have evolved some sort of presentation layer. I mean, CSS is kind of a presentation layer, but they could have built that into the internet, and it didn't happen. And so I think that's just an important thing to point out. So front-end code is the design. HTML and CSS define everything explicitly. They define the layout, the color, the topography. Writing code is actually having power over the substance of your experience. And coding your own designs, I think, gives designers the ability to manipulate these directories directly. And then the last thing is that knowledge of the code, so kind of studying the textbook examples of CSS, are extremely important, but they're not enough. You really have to use CSS in order to really understand what it can do. And of course, this is really awesome. I don't think we appreciate this enough. As web designers, we have the ability to control the end product. Unlike our peers in print design and in architecture and in 3D modeling, we, if we want to, get to skip that representational level of modeling something in a 3D modeling program or mocking something up in InDesign and sending it to a printer. We are able to act as both the InDesign level and the print level. So it's not necessary to write code, but I think it's important that we all appreciate the opportunity to write code, even if we don't act on it. Unfortunately, this tool, CSS, is a mess. It's extremely powerful, and it works well, but there's lots of frustration with it, and I think that's important to talk about. So CSS offers all of the frustrations and obstacles of a programming language, but it doesn't have the most powerful parts, right? There are no variables, there are no expressions. And of course, there are these movements now to build new tools that have these tools in them, or these things in them, kind of mathematical expressions. But CSS is fundamentally different than most programming languages, right? It's a presentation language. Developers who study all sorts of back-end code don't necessarily know CSS because it's so different. All of the different parts of CSS are talking explicitly about visualizing something, not about generating code. So I think many developers and most designers do everything they can to stay out of CSS. It's often the last step. And the paradox is, I think that CSS is difficult, but it's actually a great portal for entry for people who are interested in getting involved with the internet. And I think that its limitations and the fact that it is a mess, as we're going to talk about, can actually make it a really good design tool for certain kinds of websites, not for all websites. And so I have a problem with people talking about the word best practices. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that best practices have a place. But ultimately, when you're talking about design, many best practices come down to simple things like alignment, simplicity, legibility, providing context and familiarity. So if you're talking about laying out like a web form, there are of course best practices, but these things are more best design practices than they are best web form practices in my opinion. Another point is that websites are mortal. They all die, right? We like to think that our designs are going to live forever, but if you spend all of your time making everything perfect, and in 5 years it's gone, then what have you spent your time doing? I think if we're going to devote a crazy amount of time to something on the internet, it should be on making your content great. That's kind of something that Tiffany Jones talked about earlier in her talk. So new classes of devices are making our best practices obsolete. That's another point. iPhones, iPads, Windows mobile phones, all of these things are changing the way that the best practices affect websites. Another point is that metrics, which we use to measure what our best practices are and to define our best practices, are really great, but they have a difficult time adapting to change, and they can blind us to new models of design. And so the point here is that front-end code is constantly changing, and that online content is constantly changing. And so maybe what's more important is kind of figuring out a way to be like Jimi Hendrix and to learn a way of working that works for you. It's like any handcraft, like playing guitar or like making like metalsmithing. What's important is that you spend a lot of time in the studio working with the code, working with the design to get good experience. And so while there may not be best practices, I think that everyone can have their own personal best practices or practices that they prefer and that allow them to kind of visualize the design that they want that they have in their head in code or in Photoshop. And so this next section I'm going to go into deals with some very basic and very simple practices that I prefer when I write code in CSS. So I'm just going to try and show you a little bit of my process. And hopefully this will allow you to see how you can develop your own process, maybe learn a little trick or two. In my opinion, kind of a personalized style of coding CSS is key to harnessing the power of CSS. And ultimately, nothing beats the experience of working in CSS every day. It's the best way to develop your own style of code. And so my disclaimer here is that I'm definitely an expert in the way that I work in CSS and the way I design websites, but that's kind of it. That's my disclaimer. So CSS strategies, highly subjective advice on how to write Ninja quality code. First, you have to pick your application. We all have kind of a preferred desktop piece of software we use to write code. I use a text editor. It's very lightweight. I like the direct connection you have to the code. The autocomplete saves me hours every week. And the code coming from the keyboard and not from the mouse is something that I think is really powerful. But of course, there are other options. There are, what you see is what you get options, like Expression Web 3, that are fully featured development environments that work on multiple files at the same time, that also have back-end development, that have built-in server upload. And so I think ultimately what's important here is that what you want to use is what you should use. There are no kind of best practices around what application you should use. Another good thing to talk about in CSS are frameworks. Should you use frameworks or not? So for small websites, I think frameworks can be really awesome. Blueprint, 960 grid systems, Yahoo grid systems, all of these things can really greatly speed up the way you code. They can standardize all of your classes for you without you having to do it yourself. They're highly customizable. Things like 960GS are super lightweight. They have great cross-browser support. But they can make it difficult later on for other designers coming in to kind of work within that code. And they can be problematic because designers using grid systems often give up their own control. And so I never actually use these, though I endorse them in some ways. When you're talking about larger sites, so things like Facebook or any other site that has lots and lots of designers and developers working on it, I think working with a framework is good, but you need to create your own proprietary framework. And so even if you use something like 960 grid systems to kind of build your own basic set of columns, most big companies that I have talked with kind of end up with their own set of core styles that they can kind of pull in or pull out depending on what page you're talking about. And so in some ways, a framework is nothing more than a reusable collection of CSS. And these huge sites create discrete packets of CSS, kind of like backend code that they can pull in and out. So another thing to talk about are doc types. I think it's important. These things are kind of ridiculous in a way, right? So much time has been spent talking about things like doc types. That's why I'm using them as an example. I think what's really important here is that you're using something that's comfortable to you. And so it's up to you. It's not even funny. The most recent doc type is the one you should be using unless you have a reason not to. And in HTML5, the doc type is essentially deprecated. There is one you can use it. That's it, exclamation point doc type HTML, but it's not even required. And so a movement away from the kind of strict, weird standards we have in HTML right now is definitely the future, and I think it's a good thing. Similarly, you can add a character set declaration in your CSS file at the top. Makes you feel good, and I think that's really important. What's important is that you feel really proud of your code and you feel like it's complete. So these little details make a big difference. CSS resets. I'm sure lots of you use these if you do your own CSS. They make coding easier, much easier to code from scratch if you're using a reset. They kind of give you that fresh feeling when you're working and you're not dealing with the default browser things. And so this is just the reset I use. To avoid using resets with the universal selector is probably the only rule, because that really slows down the way the browser renders the CSS. And so another important part, I think, of working well within CSS is to kind of develop your own set of personalized styles over time. By styles, I mean classes. And so as I was talking about before, as large companies use their own frameworks and develop their own proprietary set of code that they use to build their websites, as I've worked over the years, have kind of built a collection of classes, of layout classes that I use in most of my projects. And I only end up keeping the ones that I'm actually using in the final CSS file, but I found that this is kind of an interesting way to speed up your process and keep the code all within your control, but still have the flexibility of a framework, if that makes sense. Maybe the most important thing about using CSS to quickly make a website is to come up with your own order for CSS style properties. So I don't know, do any of you with CSS kind of have your own order of CSS style properties? Anybody? One, maybe two. I don't know if I'm a little boring right now, but to me this is the most important thing when you're doing CSS, is to have your own kind of internal order. It's not going to make any sense, and it's not going to be logical. But this is the order I use. I always put visibility in front of position, in front of z-index, in front of top, in front of right. And what that means, when I go back into the code, it's very easy for me to find whether or not I'm using something on that particular class or that particular ID. Along the same lines, structuring the actual way your CSS file is laid out is really important to being proficient with CSS. And so legibility is the key. I think this is probably the most commonly, I see this more than any other way of laying out CSS. It's really clear. You can go through and read what properties are being applied to what ID and what class really simply, and that's really awesome. And that's how I started out coding. But I've moved to kind of taking away the indented duck and putting everything on one line. And to me, this has also been another huge thing that has made my CSS become much more efficient. So by kind of condensing everything, it becomes much easier to find what you're looking for in the file. And if you have that kind of custom property, that custom order of properties from the last topic, it's very easy to go through and see whether or not you're floating something, for example, without having to read each piece in the line, because you'll know where it'll be in the order. And then even more recently, I've been indenting things. And so the MIX Online website, which I had the pleasure of coding, this is just a little snippet of the CSS. And so by putting everything on one line and then kind of indenting related ID and class declarations, it makes it much easier to scan through the code and tell what's going on without having to search for it or scroll through a huge, huge file. And so just to repeat, all of these little things are these little tricks I use because CSS is a mess. And keeping track of it is absolutely vital to using it effectively. So this is something that I find really interesting that I didn't even know until about a year ago, are the specificity algorithm in CSS. So maybe this will blow 1 or 2 minds, I don't know. So this is kind of the grid that people use when they're, the browsers use when they are determining what style declarations have precedence over other ones. So the way that the W3C spec is written, straight elements like div or paragraph, those get for each one of those there is a number placed in the 1 position. For each class, there's a number placed in the kind of 10. If you imagine this is a 10 base number in the 10 position. And for each ID, it gets 100. And so what you do is you count up in your CSS file each line. And so the first one, there's one ID, and so it has a specificity of 100. And the second example, header.nav.list item, there are two classes in that, and there's one element, and so that is a specificity of 21, and so forth down the page. And that simple, knowing this allows you to make very precise CSS files that don't have lots and lots of declarations where they're not needed. Image sprites. I assume most people know what image sprites are. Does anyone not know what an image sprite is? Anybody? A couple people? Okay, so image sprites are a way of condensing a lot of images on a web page into one file. And that helps you streamline how quickly your website is downloaded and how many HTTP requests are being made to the server. And so this is one of the Facebook CSS sprites. And so this is one image file. And what the website does is it goes through each place an icon is used and sets this huge image as the background image, and then creates a specific height and width. So say you had a link with a poke icon, for example, because everyone pokes on Facebook. You could set that link to maybe 10 pixels wide by 10 pixels high, and then you'd set this as the background image, and then you'd position that image precisely in this grid to where the poke icon is. And so this is just a little tip that people use to keep everything simple. Another way to use image sprites is when you're doing buttons or things that have hover states or active states. Image sprites are really nice because instead of loading a new image, you can just move where the image is. And so you can put all three states, active and hover. So like when the mouse goes over a button or when you click on a button, all of those can go in one file, and you can just move the background position to achieve the effect of the button changing. And so there are just a couple examples here of image sprites that are kind of cool. You guys may probably recognize all of these without me even saying what they are. That's image sprite on apple.com. That's one on bing.com. I think they're interesting because they really kind of give you a sense of what the style is of each site. That's google.com. That's YouTube. It's interesting. Looking at image sprites is an interesting way of kind of evaluating the look and feel. Facebook actually did that. They went through and looked at all of their icons, and just looking at the image sprite was the best way to kind of determine which icons were out of place and which icons were the best, or the most consistent. And this is the one for the Mix Online site, a couple of the image sprites I made. So another very simple thing that might be interesting to a couple people are CSS colors. With CSS3, we're gaining a huge number of ways of defining CSS colors. So the top level are the colors built in with language by black, red, blanched almond, my favorite. The second row is kind of hexadecimal values for these same colors. And the third row is just a little tip. There are some colors, if you have three numbers, so like the second example, red, there's two Fs, two zeros, and two zeros. You can abbreviate that just with three characters, F00. And I actually find that if I'm struggling with color combinations on websites, sometimes it's really nice to just use simple web colors with 3 digits as a way of preventing me from spending obsessive hours going through and making minor changes. Commenting. I think a lot of web designers suffer from like commentitis. They go through and they comment everything, and they explain which div is moving which column and which link is and changing which other link. And I think that's good, but I think the idea here is to inform without your comments getting in the way. So when you're going through, it's really important that you kind of don't label everything. If your code is really good, your code should be legible without comments. I think it's important that you call out major sections, and so if you're going through a page, it should say right column or left column as a readable comment. But other than that, unless there's something strange going on, try and avoid over-commenting your file. Fixing bugs. 90% of the time, what you have to do is validate your code. And of course, validating, I won't talk about it too much because I'm sure you guys are all bored to death talking about validating, but I'll just throw out there that once I've kind of thrown validating my code into my workflow much more often, and so when I'm writing an HTML file or a CSS file, I validate the code pretty consistently as I go, and that helps me avoid big problems later on, and it helps me keep things, So I think a lot of bugs that you see that are cross-browser bugs, for example, so if something's working in Firefox but not working in IE, validating will take care of that most of the time. And if it doesn't, then you're kind of learning something about the different idiosyncrasies of the browsers. And so for the remaining bugs, I just want to say avoid browser hacks. So I've done a couple sites. I worked at a company called Catalyst for 1.5 years. And when I got there, I didn't know too much about CSS. And we had to support IE6 and IE7, or it was just IE6, I think, at the time. But I went through and I just used a lot of browser hacks to call out CSS just specifically for IE or specifically for Firefox. And that was fine, and it worked well, but then when IE7 came out, all of that stuff was broken. And so there are some times when you can avoid specifically calling out browsers and CSS, but if at all possible, I prefer not to use any browser hacks. We'll look at the MIX Online example later on, and I was really happy because in the end there was literally no browser hack in the entire thing. The exception to this, of course, is CSS6. As less people are using it, and since it's a relatively older model of CSS, I think if you're building a site right now at this specific moment, and there are problems in IE6, it makes sense to kind of separate out a separate style sheet or a separate set of styles just for that you can remove in 5 years when it's no longer a browser people are using. So just for a quick second, I want to talk about Super Preview, which is pretty cool. As I said earlier, I use the text editor most of the time and not like a WYSIWYG editor, but in Expression Web 3, which is Microsoft's kind of Dreamweaver competitor, it's a really great program actually. I was really surprised having never used it. There's this feature called Super Preview, which allows you to take your code and view it in multiple browsers at the same time. So you can literally pull up your code, push a button, and see side-by-side comparisons of Safari and Firefox and IE6 and IE7. And that's the best part, is that you can compare multiple versions of the same browser. Many of you probably know that you can't install IE6 and IE7 and IE8 without kind of hacking it. And the hacking kind of works, but it's also difficult when you have to, when IE9 comes out and there's another version to add. And so this is a way to kind of look at multiple versions of Firefox next to each other and determine what's going on. And then even cooler is that it lets you overlay these versions on top of one another or on top of a comp. And so for me, if you're taking a static comp and turning it into code, what's really important are kind of the pixel level details, is that you get the code to render the page as precisely to that comp as possible. And the way I do that is I just grab quick screenshots and throw them in Photoshop over top of the comp and make them slightly transparent. And that lets me see, as you can see here, which headers are slightly off. And the good thing about this is that you can do it real time. And so instead of having to grab screenshots over and over again, you can change the height of a header, for example, and click refresh, and it'll show you this change automatically right away. So that's pretty cool. One more thing. I'm a big fan of testing both Mac and Windows. They render text very differently. We're going to look at some comps later on for MIX Online, and you'll notice that even the way Photoshop renders text, depending on how you anti-alias the text, ends up looking very different than how the browser does. And so if possible, if you can test your website on both OS X and Windows and even Linux, it'll go a long way towards making everybody happy with the eventual product. Another little CSS trick are clear fixes. Does anyone suffer from having to use clear fixes a lot? A couple people? Yeah, maybe like 10 people. I hate clear fixes. I hate this. In case you don't know what they are, I don't want to get too technical because it's a little boring, but if you're floating elements in CSS like the red box and the green box inside of a larger container, since they're taken out of the way the browser flows elements in HTML, any sort of border around the parent box or any sort of background color isn't pulled down beneath the box. And if this is making sense to you, that's fine, because if this ever happens, you'll know what's going on right away, because it's really terrible. So I do a lot of layouts where columns are floated to the left or to the right, and that's really great. But if there's some sort of larger background that needs to go down to the bottom of the page, it won't go down unless you apply what's called a clear fix. And so there are a couple ways to do this. One way of doing this is to use this overflow hidden property, which seems extremely random. It's not even made for this, but that fixes the problem and brings the background down to the bottom. Another way is to use this set of strange after pseudo classes in CSS. And what this does is it does the same thing and brings down the code. But the problem is with this, you've got to separate out one version for IE6, which is the star HTML in the middle, one version for IE7 and 8, which is the star : first child. So this is probably the best way to do it because it doesn't really affect the rest of your code, but it's also a really ugly way to do it. I've been using overflow hidden just because it's so simple. But I think going forward, I'm going to be using this kind of last section at the bottom, in which every single element that needs to be clear fixed, I do specifically. So instead of, a lot of people, what they do is they make a clear fix class. So they have a class clear fix, and they apply that in HTML to every element that needs this fix done to it. That's kind of the second version at the top. And that's fine, but that's really easy to lose track of what you're clear fixing. And so the bottom example, I'm actually specifically calling out each element that gets the clear fix. It's much uglier, but I think going forward, it's much more maintainable. So that's my advice. And then finally, when you're coding in CSS, the most important thing, in my opinion, is that at the end of the process, you refactor the code. And by refactor, I mean go through and clean it up multiple times, make it consistent, take out things you're not using. It's very time-consuming, but this is an example of MIX10. And so when I was finished kind of doing all of the comps, this was the length of the CSS file on the left. It was 763 lines. It's kind of a mess. And so it took me about 5 days, not full time, but over the course of a week. I went through and made everything consistent. I made consistent classes for lots of headers that I wasn't doing already. I went through and made the columns more consistent. I ended up with 481 lines. And those lines are much better. They're much more precise. And I think for the team, it's going to be much easier for them to maintain the website because the code is that much clearer. So this is extremely obvious, but when you're coding, make sure you look for elements with similar styles so that you're reducing the number of styles and standardizing the CSS. This is the way you write CSS, right? You find some common design elements and you pull them out into classes. But what's cool about it is that it also kind of sets up this proprietary framework like I was talking about before. As you end up with discrete kinds of CSS, you end up with kind of a toolkit you can deploy as you're coding more websites or more pages that you haven't designed yet. But that said, you don't want things to be too interconnected or they'll become really rigid and any changes will break them. And so it's hard to talk about this explicitly or specifically, but CSS needs to stay flexible while it's standardized. And it's easier to figure this out, in my opinion, at the very end. And so the problem is, as the designer, I'm always designing everything the last night, right? And my code ends up being really dirty. And so one interesting thing about kind of disconnecting the comp process, the design process, from the coding process, even if you have different designers do it or if you do it yourself, is that you end up having the ability to go back in and make these kinds of changes so that the CSS is much better and much more maintainable going forward. So this is the section that gets really near and dear to my heart, excuse me. Designing in CSS without a static image. So code is abstract. This is the important point when you're thinking about designing in CSS. So in the matrix, the code kind of defines the physical spaces of the world, right? But the matrix is a lie. In real life, that's not how it works. In reality, code is this indirect medium. And you can't read the design of a website just by looking at the CSS file. CSS is a language. It's not a drawing medium. And of course, design is applied, right? So the problem with comps is that they lack context. They lack real content. Photoshop lies in that regard. And so the good thing about using CSS is that you're able to use dynamic content or even just more content. CSS is representational, so it's an indirect way to design. But it also allows designers the ability to quickly iterate and tweak the details of a design. So I'd say whether or not you design in CSS or Photoshop depends on the website you're doing. Designing in Photoshop is great if you're doing what I would call a brochure or a website based on presenting things kind of without kind of a standardized hierarchy, where CSS is really great if you're designing websites that have like one common element that's iterated over and over and over again. And so if you're designing an interface or a product, as we call it at Facebook, designing in CSS is really powerful because it allows you to change paddings and margins and font sizes all down the page with a click of a button. And so at Facebook, it's interesting because we have this division built into the design team. There's a communication design team, which is in charge of all of the kind of internal and external facing jobs websites, the developer API website, the websites that are kind of presenting content to static content to the public. Whereas the interfaces that are presenting content that's based on your own personal Facebook profile, the product as we call them, those are designed usually in CSS. So just quickly to do this MIX10 example, MIX10 is this website for the Microsoft team of the MIX10 team, excuse me. It was designed by Matt Brown and Things That Are Brown, and the content and the copywriting was done by Tiffany Brown, Things That Are Brown. And so I don't know if you've seen the site or not, but this was Matt's comp for the kind of article pages of the website. It's a beautiful page. And then you'll notice this next thing is a screenshot of the final website. And so you'll notice all these tiny little differences. Part of it is that I couldn't get the slides precisely lined up, but part of it is that there's a difference. As I mentioned, text looks different, right? Depending on what browser you're in and what OS you're in, you're never going to get these perfect. And so this was just to give you kind of a glimpse into what it looks like. to develop a comp. This was like the very first state of getting this image into code, right? You'll see that I've kind of started pulling out the container level styles. So we've got the left content container, we've got the right sidebar container, we've got the header, and these are just more iterations. And so I think what's interesting to take away from the Mix Online example is that Matt, as he was designing in Photoshop, I don't want to speak for him, but designing in Photoshop is great because it allows you to add in lots and lots of little style details that would just be crazy if you're designing in CSS. So each of these kind of blue blocks is a separate style in the CSS. So there's like a divider style, and there are little links at the top, and there are links above the article. And if I was doing this in CSS, kind of setting all of this up would drive me crazy, and it probably would end up with half as many styles, and the page would look much less interesting and much less beautiful. And so this is an example, I think, of a website, even though it's got dynamic content, and it's a pretty big website, but that benefited from being designed in Photoshop versus being designed in CSS. Here's just a couple other pages from the site. And you'll see, as I was saying, that each page has a bunch of different kind of styles to them. It's using non-web fonts, beautiful non-web fonts. It's using different layouts across the different pages. There are lots of standard elements, but each page is very different. And that's the great thing about the site, I think, one of the great things. And so another kind of example for all of this was a site I did recently called Pinterest. And this is a site that I designed entirely in CSS. And so just so it's a little background, Pinterest is a site that kind of lets you create galleries of content you find on the web into collections. It's a web application. And this is kind of the most important page of the application. It's called what we call the board page. And so this is, in the application, this is a collection of posters with words on them that someone has gone through and curated by finding images on the web that you liked. And what you'll notice about this website, which was designed in CSS, is that there's one element, right? There's this kind of container around the image that's repeated all over the web page. And on the right, there are other images, there are other elements, like, say, her other board links at the bottom right, that are kind of repeated down the page. You can see the influence, I think, of designing this website in CSS and not Photoshop, simply in the kind of repeatedness of the elements. So just to go through this quickly, this was the very first, as I was designing this page, this was the very first example. It's really ugly. It takes a very special kind of client to be willing to bear with you as you design in CSS. Because as you start, you focus so much on the layout that the kind of beautiful design details don't happen until later on. And so these are just progressively different CSS mockups that I was doing of this page. You can see us experimenting with different layouts, irregular grids, different kinds of headers. Now we're getting closer to the final page, and then we're back to the final page again. And so I just thought this would be an interesting glimpse for you guys to see. I think we're going to go through this a little bit later. So these are some other pages from that site. Again, you're going to notice that each one of these pages kind of has one element or two or three elements that is styled and then repeated down the page, right? Which is what CSS is really good at. It's really good at standardizing styles. All right, getting towards the end. Just want to talk for a minute about CSS3 because CSS3 is pretty cool. It lets you do a lot of kind of mock-up stuff without having to use Photoshop. So if you go back to the Pinterest example, if we want to pimp it out, say, with a little bit of Chrome, this is kind of, say, this is HTML. This is the very standard, basic way to start, right? You've got your containers that are going off the bottom of the page, but as you can imagine, this page being super long and all of the pins, as these are called, going down to the bottom of the page. In CSS3, it's great because there's this new column element, right? And so we can add in column count 5 and a couple other columns, like the padding between the columns and things, and end up, without touching the HTML, with this beautiful kind of irregular grid of columns. And then we can go through with CSS, and we can add rounded corners, if that's your thing. And it's very simple by changing a number, using this border radius property, to change the size of it. The size of the rounded corner. Whereas in Photoshop, you'd have to go through and do it manually by clicking on it and going up to the top and typing in a new number. CSS allows you to change these things very rapidly. Same thing with kind of drop shadows, what they call a box shadow. I'm not saying that this website looks better with all of these things, but I think it's interesting to see the power that CSS3 enables you to kind of mock things up without having to use Photoshop. And you can add drop shadows into your text. So, kind of wrapping up, arriving at the code, picking a process for your project. What is the best process? Should we wireframe? Should we comp? And then should we code? Should we go straight from Photoshop to code? Should there be a prototype phase where there are these dynamic coded elements that are just examples of how interactions work? I mean, ultimately, the answer is it totally depends on what you want to do, on what you're good at, and on the project. And I think what's really important here is that the final code is, for this talk, is that the final code is as awesome and as clean and as maintainable as possible. It's important that you think and you make. So this is kind of my motto. You communicate your thinking through your making. And if you can, you get good at both all of the practical details of writing a website, as well as all of the conceptual understandings, all of the ways that web design and graphic design can communicate to the public. And learning to work with CSS and Photoshop comps both is, I think, the way you learn how the web really works. And that'll make you a great designer. So that's kind of the end of this main part. And then if you guys have any questions, I was given 3 or 4 O'Reilly coupons. So anyone who asks a question gets a free O'Reilly book out in the lobby. Does anybody have a question? Sorry, go ahead. There should be a mic in the back. Is there? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about strategies to differentiate the visual styles versus the logical styles. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Maybe. Can you mind explaining with the detail?
Sure. So the designer, the person who's going to look at the Photoshop file and kind of lay it out to make it look beautiful, is going to use certain strategies and might change during the development process on what's a div, what's a span, how he's going to name them, and all of that stuff. In the meantime, you've got your front-end programmer who's doing a bunch of jQuery selectors. And is going to fill it with data, with API calls and whatever. And for that person, the ID of the container or the class
is extremely important.
It matters a lot, and it can't change. How do you put those two things together?
I mean, I hope I've got an answer that satisfies you. One answer is that people just work very closely, right? That's kind of boring, but in all of the teams I've worked on, I'll just use Facebook as an example because that's where I work right now. Everything we design at Facebook is done with one product designer, one product manager, and then a very small group of engineers. And they all work extremely closely on everything. But I think another way to do that, to kind of say another answer, would be to really think about the static CSS code the static HTML and CSS before you start adding in things like dynamic content. And so if you think about designing CSS, right? If you think about designing websites in CSS instead of Photoshop, that's an example of where the code that the designer creates before there's any engineering involved, is much easier to turn into a final product, if you see what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
You talked about making CSS frameworks and things like that. I've been working on making my CSS more modular, but I've had trouble passing that along to the next person and having them figure out how all that works. They might have a more traditional view of CSS where everything has its own class and and sort of like that. So what's your advice for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in my experience, this is not a good answer, but the simpler you can keep things, the better, right? And so I think a lot of it comes down to really detailed naming of classes, right? Is your class named, two or h-2 column, or is it named, half column right? When I code, I always try and make the class names and the ID names as long as possible, or not as long as possible, but as explicit as possible. I think that's one answer to that question. Another answer would be just keeping the number of styles you're using down to a bare minimum. I don't know.
Okay.
Does that help? And maybe one last question would be to hook up the engineer if they don't have it with something like Firebug, which makes it really easy to go in and see what the class is on the element you're trying to style. That's how I do a lot of changing of code that's already around. Is I figure out kind of in the browser with Firebug what the container, what the class is on the container, and then I go into the CSS file from there. So,
with all the advancements in CSS, do you still feel that it's safer to develop layouts with tables?
I I
don't have a clear fix issue.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I never use tables for layout, but at the risk of being flamed down by somebody who really cares about this, I think if it works for you, you should go ahead and do it. I mean, that said, tables are very, as I was saying before, if your code is too rigid, then when you want to change something later on, it's very difficult. And I think the HTML is so deep and so specific with tables that it's very difficult to kind of get a handle on all those elements in CSS if you want to change the layout. So you just have to be aware, I think, of the project you're working on and the strategy you want to go with going forward. That makes sense.
Thank you. Also, that picture with the barcode building, where did you get from?
Where did I get that picture from?
Yeah.
That was from Flickr.
Okay. It's not a real building, right?
No, but I just thought it was a good example. It's not a real building?
Yeah, it's a work by one Russian developer. I know him personally.
Oh, really?
He's really good. I mean, it looks like a real building.
It looks like a real building, yeah. But it's kind of like the Matrix, right? It's not actually real. Thanks. Is there any other questions? If not, you can come up and talk to me afterwards. And if you did ask a question and you want these coupons, feel free to come see me right now. Thank you.